Welcome to Real World, Real Talk with Dr. D.Z. Cofield. This show represents captivating conversations and insightful information to encourage and inspire you with all you need to become the best you can possibly be. And now, your host for Real World, Real Talk, Dr. D.Z. Cofield.
There we go. Welcome to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. D.Z. Cofield, and I want to welcome you to your number one source for jazz, your member-supported public radio station, KTSU 90.9 on the FM dial and KTSUradio.com. Today on our show, we're going to talk all things COVID as we're seeing cases on the rise and seeing hopefully more people getting vaccinated. We're still in the fight for our lives, and we're seeing now children being adversely affected by this virus in some very scary ways. And so today we have with us, I think, one of the premier virologists in the world to share with us what's going on. He's a return guest, and I'm excited to have him with us. But just a couple of housekeeping matters before we get started. First of all, if you'd like to follow me during the week, you can follow me on Instagram at DZ Cofield. You can follow me on Facebook at DZ Cofield, and you can follow me on Twitter at, you guessed it, DZ Cofield. Some exciting things are happening and some alarming things are happening in our world. National COVID deaths have climbed to an average of more than 1,900 a day for the first time since early March, with experts saying the virus is preying largely on a distinct group, 71 million unvaccinated Americans. It's amazing how many people want to portray and talk about breakthrough cases when the overwhelming majority of people who are being adversely affected by the variants are those who are unvaccinated. The increasingly lethal turn has filled hospitals, complicated the start of the school year, delayed the return to offices, and demoralized healthcare workers. The nation was stunned back in December when we were witnessing some 3,000 deaths a day, but that was when almost no one was vaccinated. Now, nearly 64% of the U.S. population has received at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine, and yet average deaths per day have climbed 40% over the past 2 weeks, from 1,387 to 1,947 deaths, according to data from Johns Hopkins University. Health experts say the vast majority of the hospitalized and dead have been unvaccinated. When you hear people talk about, oh, well, it's 50-50. No, it's not. Some vaccinated people have suffered breakthrough infections, but those infections tend to be mild in terms of their symptoms. The number of vaccine-eligible Americans who have yet to get a shot has been put at more than 70 million people. President Joe Biden announced this past week that the United States is doubling its purchase of Pfizer's COVID-19 shots to 1 billion doses so we can share with other countries who need them. The president is embracing the goal of vaccinating 70% of the global population within the next year. About 160 million shots supplied by the U.S. have already been distributed to more than 100 countries, representing more donations than the rest of the world combined. The remaining American doses will be distributed over the coming year. Biden says to beat the pandemic here, we need to beat it everywhere. Adding, for every one shot we've administered to date in America, we have now committed to do 3 shots to the rest of the world. The latest purchase reflects only a fraction of what will be necessary to meet a goal of vaccinating 70% of the citizens of each nation by next September's United Nations meeting. Biden is pressing other high-income countries to do more in their vaccine sharing plans. And we see incentives going forth. Let's get some really hardcore information on what's happening with the COVID-19 and the variants and the pandemic. I am so excited to welcome back to Real World, Real Talk our friend, Dr. Peter Hotez. He is the Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics and Molecular Virology and Microbiology at Baylor College of Medicine, where he is also the co-director of the Texan Children's Center for Vaccine Development and Texas Children's Hospital Endowed Chair of Tropical Pediatrics. In 2017, he was named by Fortune magazine one of the 34 most influential people in healthcare, while in 2018, he received the Sustained Leadership Award from Research America. He is a vaccine scientist and an autism parent, and has led national efforts to defend vaccines and to serve as an ardent champion of vaccines, going up against a growing national anti-vax threat. He appears frequently on television, including BBC, CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, radio, including KTSU, and in newspaper interviews, including the New York Times, USA Today, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal. Let's welcome to Real World, Real Talk, Dr. Peter Hotez. Dr. Hotez, how are you doing, sir?
It's great to see you, Dr. Cofield. You look terrific.
Man,
that was a great introduction, by the way. I think you hit all my high points there. I'm gonna call the cable news channels and tell them you're gonna do my 5 a.m. slot now. So
there you go. There you go.
Yeah, you can do the Fox News one if you like.
No, I'm gonna let you handle all of that, Doc. I'm gonna let you handle all of that.
They I think I'm persona non gratis with them for a while anyway. It's okay.
So let's talk about what's happening, Dr. Hotez. Over 1,900 deaths a day in the last 2 weeks, according to Johns Hopkins University. We came to a point where we felt like we had broken through, and now it seems like we're getting hit with a second wave, another tsunami, maybe third wave. Where are we right now, and what is guiding the sentiment of people as we are battling the variants and going into school and the like?
So I was hoping for a much better summer and fall, Pastor Cofield. It was back in March. I remember doing an interview with Lisa Gray, the Houston Chronicle, and I said, I think we can, if we keep vaccinating at this trajectory, I think we can vaccinate our way out of this epidemic. We're going to have a great summer and fall. And things still continued along up in the Northeast, in the New England states, Mid-Atlantic states, and the West Coast. They still continued to vaccinate, but then everything ground to a halt down in this part of the country. Here in Texas, here in the southern states, we basically couldn't get people to get vaccinated after April, May. And we can talk about why in a few minutes, but the bottom line was we had a huge segment of the population in the southern states defiant of getting vaccinated, and it's had disastrous consequences. So you point out those 1,900, 2,000 deaths per day. That's a serious number. That means COVID-19 is one of the leading causes of death, maybe the leading cause of death on a daily basis in the United States. And you know what? All of those deaths since April, May are happening despite the widespread availability, abundance of safe and effective vaccines. So all of these deaths are unnecessary. These are all deaths that could be prevented had people gotten vaccinated. So we're talking serious numbers. 100,000 Americans have unnecessarily lost their lives since April, May, with no end in sight, really. The projections coming from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, University of Washington, my colleagues there, say, Peter, we're looking at 800,000 deaths by the end of the year. So that's another 100,000 change on top of what we have now. And it's just so heartbreaking to see people unnecessarily lose their lives, to be, in the ICU with buyer's remorse, saying, "Oh man, I should have gotten vaccinated," and now the nurse telling me I'm going to be intubated, and then they lose their lives. These are parents, right? These are parents often of young kids or teenagers. There's no word for it. It's a combination of heartbreak, and it's so demoralizing for me, devoting my whole life to developing vaccines as a humanitarian goal, to see these vaccines sit on the shelf, not being used or allowed to expire because people don't want to save their own lives or their family members' lives.
So a very wise man named Peter Hotez said some time ago that what will probably begin to move us, the catalyst to move us to getting vaccinated, if nothing else, would be seeing and knowing people who have died as a result of this disease. I was moved early on. Two moments I will not forget. One was watching a nightly news broadcast and seeing one of the first gentlemen in our country in New York who died of COVID-19, who was a friend of mine that I have known for 40 years, 35 years. I hadn't been in touch with him recently, but to see his name and to see his face come up on the screen, I was like, oh my God, and called a mutual friend of ours. And he said, man, it was a super spreader event, and at least, 30 people, got the virus. And this gentleman had buried, and he was a pastor, probably about 20 to 25 people out of his church who were at that event who died as a result of COVID-19. And it was so bad that not only were they not having funeral services, but even the committal services, they wouldn't let pastors into the cemetery. They were literally standing at the gates of the repository, and they were just pronouncing as funeral processions came in. They were just announcing, hey, here it is, making a committal, and that was it. And so it was really, really hard. And then I think the second thing, we had 2 members of our congregation die early on. And we probably had another 20 or 30 over several months who contracted the virus. But those 2 people dying within the first 60 days was enough for me. Now I'm seeing that happen again. Just this past week, we've had probably 4 or 5 people, not necessarily affiliated with our church, but friends or people who used to work for us, who are in their 30s, in their 40s, who weren't vaccinated, who have succumbed to COVID-19. What's happening now? What do you think is helping to raise awareness and move some people to get vaccinated?
Well, I think this is why I'm with you on a Sunday, right? Because this is a crisis situation. We've got to talk about it. But also, I think one of the things that is starting to happen is we're at a point now where people are seeing their unvaccinated friends, their relatives, loved ones, colleagues dying of COVID. So I think they're starting to see a little bit of an autocorrection. I think there's a couple of things happening to close that 70 million gap. And I'm glad you brought up that number, that 70 million gap, because that's what we need to stop transmission. We need all of those 70 million people vaccinated. So I think you are seeing a bit of what I call autocorrection, that people are saying, oh my God, this thing is real after all, and agreeing to get vaccinated. I also think we're hearing from the president, President Biden, implement some mandates at the federal level. But there are limits to federal power by design in the Constitution. So he can vaccinate the armed forces, he can vaccinate the Veterans Administration. So those things will help. He's trying to get the Department of Labor to implement a law that says if you have over 100 employees, you have to get them vaccinated. But of course, the governors down in this part of the country are trying to mount legal challenges to that, which is unfortunate. So we'll see how far we can get. But the reality is this, Dr. Cofield, if we're serious about vaccinating our way out of this epidemic, and it is possible, but the bar is high. We're talking more than 80% of the whole country has to be vaccinated, maybe 85, maybe even 90%. That's just about every adult and adolescent who's eligible to get vaccinated has to do it. And you might say, well, come on, let's forget it. That's never going to happen. I say, well, no, it happens every year. We do this for polio. We do this for measles. We do it all the time. We just have to figure out a way to convince people to do this for COVID-19, because you don't want to be one of those 1,900 per day statistic. And that's what we're seeing right now in our Texas Medical Center. Numbers may be coming down a little bit now, but we have at any given time, several hundred people in our Texas Medical Center with COVID, and with a lot of exhausted nurses and hospital staffs who also are demoralized because they know they're not vaccinated, and that's frustrating as well for them. And or they'll finish their shift and they'll go to HEB or wherever, and they'll see people without masks, and that's demoralizing also. So we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, it's I think the speed with which these variants have attacked people has been something that has been mind blowing. I mean, I'm hearing stories and know of people who, for example, contracted it, and 3 or 4 days later, after testing positive, they're in the hospital, and within a week they're on a ventilator, and some have passed. I mean, and again, it just seems like we don't know how it's going to affect each individual, but we know in the worst case scenario, the most tragic side effect is death.
Well, here's why. So this Delta variant, which is the overwhelming variant right now, has a mutation in a special part of the virus called the furin cleavage site. And what that does, it makes it more efficient at infecting cells, so that the amount of virus that's in your system when you get Delta is 10, 100, maybe 1,000 times more virus than we had previously with the old variants. So that's why, one, it's more contagious because you're shedding a lot more virus in your nose and mouth if you're not vaccinated. But second, if you get it, you don't have a few days to think about it. You go down pretty rapidly, and
wow.
Not even time to get a monoclonal antibody therapy. So this Delta is not messing around. It is evolved into a finely tuned, killing machine. And it arose out of an unvaccinated population in India. So as we fail to vaccinate the world, these new variants start developing, and that's now what's affecting our country.
Somebody made a statement. This is not a medical professional. This is just somebody talking. And they said that the reason for these mutations are the vaccines, that the vaccines cause the mutations. What do you say to that?
So I know exactly where that came from too. I call it anti-science aggression. I used to call it misinformation, and we called it disinformation. Now I call it anti-science aggression. This is what's happened: is the political right, the far right, has cultivated a group of intellectuals or contrarian intellectuals who just say the most outrageous things. And one of the outrageous things is these variants are arising because of the vaccines. Well, it's not true, right? The Alpha variant, the B.1.1.7 variant, arose out of an unvaccinated population in the United Kingdom last fall at this time, so the fall of 2020, September 2020, before vaccines were even available. And Delta arose out of an unvaccinated India population. So, the other thing that the contrarian intellectuals, and I have to be careful, I'm using that term intellectual sarcastically. They call themselves intellectuals, but they're not intellectuals at all. They're just aggressors. And the other thing they say is that if you're young and healthy and fit and go to the gym and take care of yourself, that's all you need. And they quote the death rates from COVID-19 and going to the gym and taking care of yourself and eating well. Those are all good things to do, but it's not a substitute for virus neutralizing antibodies from your vaccine. And you still have to get vaccinated to save your lives. And the problem is this Delta variant is just sweeping through the unvaccinated populations down here in the South. So the story is this: if you look at the difference between older Americans, the difference between the North and the South, it's not too different. So about 80% of those over the age of 65 were vaccinated down here, 95, 99% in the Northeast. The difference is young people. So we're talking, 25, 30% of young people down here are vaccinated compared to 75, 80% up there. That's the game changer. And so what you're seeing is this virus is looking at this and saying, it's having a field day, right? It's just ripping through these unvaccinated young people. It's like a hurricane over warm water. It's just picking up steam. And that's what's happened all summer, ripped through the South. And now it's moving up into West Virginia, moving outward. So into West Virginia, Kentucky, into the Carolinas. And then we have a second node forming now up in after that Sturgis motorcycle rally in South Dakota over the summer. Now you got a second one. The other big problem is Idaho, Montana. Basically, the conservative stronghold states are the places where it's really taking off. And so what we're going to see now is we're going to see 1,900 deaths per day, 2,000 deaths per day every day for the rest of the year, although where the deaths occur will move around. So right now it's been mostly in the South, slowly going down in the South with a very long tail, and then going up into West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and then the Ohio River Valley, and then up in the Mountain West. I think the New England states may be spared a little bit because they did such a good job of vaccinating. Maybe New York, they'll get hit some, but not as bad as we are. And so if you're unvaccinated, you should think that your luck's going to run out, that eventually you're going to get Delta and get very sick. And the other piece to this, Dr. Cofield, it's not just the hospitalizations. And it's not just the deaths. I mean, that's the thing people quote are death rates. But there's this thing called long COVID, and we're learning more about it every day. And the one that scares me is the brain matter degeneration if you get COVID, long COVID. So roughly about a quarter of young people in their 20s, 30s are getting long COVID if they get infected. And we're learning more about it. So there was a very important study that I quote a lot from Oxford University in the UK, and they have a real health system in the UK. It's not like what we have down here. And we have Amazon Pharmacy. They have a real health system, and the real health system is called the National Health Service. What they have on record are 40,000 brain scans before the pandemic, 40,000 MRIs, and so what they can do is anyone who gets COVID, they can bring them back and rescan them, so they can have like a perfect before and after. And they've reported on this now. What they're showing is a lot of gray matter brain degeneration. The comments on what the brain scans look like, it looks like the brain scan of an 80-year-old, even if they're in their 40s or 50s. So this resembles the cognitive decline that you see with aging or Alzheimer's disease. And that's what you're doing to yourself. If you're getting long COVID, you're having, we've been calling it brain fog. It's actually more ominous than that. So all of these are reasons why we need to get vaccinated. It's not only to stay out of the hospital or save your life. It's also, you don't want to be a 30-year-old, right? Starting a family, maybe trying to save money for a mortgage and starting out in a new job that you like, and everything's looking good. Maybe you're going to get an apartment. Maybe you're married. Maybe you got a kid. And now you're going to have cognitive decline like an 80-year-old. You don't want that. So these are the reasons why we have to get everybody vaccinated.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. D.Z. Cofield, and you're listening to your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for jazz and more, KTSU. And we have with us live Dr. Peter Hotez. Dr. Hotez, I want you to speak just for a moment around some of the vaccine hesitancy in the African American community in particular. You have a unique passion for Black and brown communities, both in this country and internationally. And one of the works that's very much quoted, I think is quoted out of context, but it's the book Medical Apartheid. And, the premise of that book is to show how the pseudoscience of eugenics in particular and social Darwinism have been used to justify experimental exploitation and shoddy medical treatment of African Americans. Of course, one of the most notorious is the Tuskegee experiment. Can you speak to somebody who is listening that, has that kind of hesitancy in this thinking, this is just one more example of medical apartheid, and this is why I don't want to get the vaccine, in terms of just your concerns, your knowledge of the science, and really who you are as a doctor?
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for that. Well, first of all, no question, the historical atrocities are just that. They're atrocities, right? They're crimes against humanity that, we just a tragic legacy here in the U.S. for decades up until 1972 when that Tuskegee experimentation ended. And even today, there are still, as I don't have to tell you, terrible racial injustices in healthcare access. And Martin Luther King Jr. has that wonderful quote of all the injustices, for him the most egregious are the injustices in healthcare access, and he's totally right. But here's the thing. So there's a lot of anti-vaccine, anti-science aggression out there. And my colleagues at the Center for Countering Digital Hate, and it's incredible that this day and age, we have to have an organization called the Center for Countering Digital Hate. It's a watchdog group based out of Washington, headed by my friend Imran Ahmed. And he's identified, their group has identified about a dozen anti-vaccine groups that dominate the internet, that have unparalleled access. And not only that, they have money to make fake documentaries and things like that. And that's what they've done. And if you look at one of these documentaries, it's pretty chilling, right? Because that's exactly what they try to do. They show people of color, Black people, getting their Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. And then it switches over to these grainy images of Tuskegee experimentation from the 50s and 60s and trying to equate the two. It's grossly exploitative, and it's racist, frankly. But people look at this and say, nod their head and say, yeah, that's what's going on here. It's not. These vaccines have been carefully tested in tens of thousands of people, and we brought in people of all races and ethnicities to make certain that the vaccines perform just as well. In fact, that held up the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, because they had trouble recruiting people of color into the clinical trials last year. And to the FDA and Pfizer's credit, and Moderna's credit, they held off releasing it till they could confirm that it was equally protective in people of color, and that's the case. And after they're released, it's not just okay, now they're released and it's adios. They have, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, have one of the most robust systems of what's called pharmacovigilance the world has ever seen. This careful system of 4 parallel tracks to follow progress in the vaccine to make certain that they're safe and effective. And the example of that is that they're able to pick up rare safety signals. So, during the pharmacovigilance, they found that about 1 in 80,000, 12 per million people can get myocarditis that could send them to the hospital, although it resolves after a couple of days, most typically. But, a very rare event, and we're able to report on it. And so that should give people comfort that there's no surprises here. And you might say, well, I'm not going to take that risk of 1 in 80,000. Well, of course you should. And the reason why is because if you get COVID, the likelihood you'll get myocarditis is 30 times higher. That's like 500 per million. And if you get COVID-19, myocarditis is the least of your problems, because you're getting stroke, you're getting myocardial infarction, you're having heart attacks, you're having gray matter brain degeneration. This is a bad actor, this virus. And so there's no question that getting vaccinated is so much safer than getting the virus.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, Dr. Hotez, because, people will talk about what you can get from the vaccine, but to your point, they don't know how much more you can get and how much more dangerous it is without the vaccine.
And this is why can you imagine a scientist, basically throwing stones at members of Congress? But what they're doing is terrible. Some of these people on the far right, Senator Johnson from Wisconsin, he has this special roundtable on people who had adverse reactions to the COVID vaccine. Come on. That's what I mean by anti-vaccine aggression from the far right. What about showing the thousands and thousands of people in intensive care units in the state of Wisconsin from COVID-19? And then, you see it coming out of the CPAC conference, right? Vaccines are political instruments of control, or first they're going to vaccinate you, and then they're going to take your guns and Bibles away. And even though it sounds completely ridiculous to us, there are a lot of people who accept that. And fortunately, the vaccine hesitancy or resistance in Black and brown communities has diminished quite a bit. And, part, I think, because, individuals like you in the clergy in the community, Black churches, you've been heroes, right? And, doing this and getting the word out about the dangers of COVID-19. And the consequence of that is, I think, the rates, and then there's groups like the Rockefeller Foundation have created a program in vaccine equity. So I think, and the Biden administration has worked hard on that. So I do think vaccine hesitancy in Black and brown communities has gotten better. Not perfect, it's still there, but it's better. But the conservative groups forget it. They're just really dug in right now with all this fake health freedom, medical freedom ideologies.
I think for us in the African American community in particular, those who are influenced by their faith leaders, those who believe in their faith leaders, are by and large accepting vaccinations as an efficacious way to fight this virus. The problem is that there is a gap between baby boomers and millennials and Gen Zers in particular in church. And so those who are not part of many of our faith communities are the ones who are not getting vaccinated, and they're the ones that the Delta variant is.
So let me ask. So my turn to ask a question, because I'm curious. So Dr. Cofield, so if you had to give me a demographic portrait of a person in the Black community who's saying they're not going to get vaccinated, would you say it's what, young males, or 20-year-old male, 30-year-old male? You can't really say.
No, I would say for many it's 40 to 35 and under, some of whom are my children and my bonus children, who I'm having conversations with, and they're kind of stuck on, my immunity is going to keep me. If it's meant for me to get it, I'm going to get it. I wear a mask all the time, etc.
Who are they listening to? I mean, you get a sense of, is there one?
So I think that they're listening primarily, in all honesty, to the internet. Mm-hmm. And they're listening in particular to people on the internet who affirm what they already believe.
Right.
So they're not necessarily looking for information. They just want affirmation and confirmation of what they already believe, which is kind of sad. And some of the questions that I'm asking you, Dr. Hotez, are questions that I've heard them ask, and I've tried to answer them. And so now I'm saying, okay, let's see if Dr. Hotez can convince you, because, at the end of the day, they don't have medical degrees, but I've told them all, there's a level of trust that you have in the medical community. And what is, I think, ASA 9, ASA 10, and ASA 11 is when you say you don't trust the medical community, so you're not going to get a vaccine, but when you get sick, you are the first one in the emergency room going to the very medical community that you say you don't trust. That's ASA 9, ASA 10, and ASA 11. It doesn't make any sense, and so, I tried to basically pick my spots, but you try to dismantle these arguments, and sometimes you have to dismantle them one by one. I want to get to that a little bit later, but Dr. Hotez, let's talk about the booster shots. The CDC is now recommending that people age 65 years and older, residents in long-term care settings, and people age 50 to 64 with underlying medical conditions should receive a booster shot of Pfizer's vaccine, especially if that vaccine is at least 6 months after they have completed their primary series. Where are we with the booster? What are you recommending? I know Moderna is in line. I know Johnson & Johnson is in line as well. What are you recommending in terms of the booster shots?
So there's a lot of confusion, and part of the confusion is because there's not complete consensus in the scientific community about what the goals are of the boosters, And then you have the problem of the company CEOs are sending out their press releases, which tends, as I often say, is when a CEO of a company sends out a press release, it's not meant for you, Dr. Cofield. It's not meant for me. It's meant for the shareholders to jack up their stock prices. And that's created a lot of confusion. It's been this way for the last 2 years, which I've been trying to fight it. But, there was never any Operation Warp Speed when that started last year, never tied any requirements to communications to the company, so they can pretty much go unfettered on that. So the point is, if you're confused, it's not your fault. You're just responding to a very confusing situation. So here's the way I think of it. First of all, you have to break it down. You have to separate the 3 vaccines: Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, J&J, because it's a different story for each of them. So for the Pfizer BioNTech, if you remember when that vaccine was released, it was given 3 weeks apart. And so you got your first dose, then 3 weeks, you got the notification, get your second dose. And that was done for a very specific reason, too, is fully vaccinate the American people as fast as we could, because we had all the nursing home residents losing their lives and healthcare providers. And it made sense, and it saved a lot of lives. The problem is, if you were designing a vaccine for long-lasting protection, you would never give 2 doses 3 weeks apart, because unless you were going to follow it up with a third one 6 months to a year later. In fact, that's what we do for all the vaccines you gave your kids as infants or your grandkids. If you remember, they get a series of vaccines as the primary immunizations as infants. You wait 6 months to a year, and then you boost. And that's what gives the long-lasting protection. Well, that's basically what you're doing now. So I make the point that the minute we went to that 3-week schedule, first dose, 3 weeks later, second dose, we basically bought ourselves a 3-dose vaccine. And it's really kind of interesting because, on social media, people were saying, "Oh, you're saying that now, Doc, but you never told us that back then." And I was able to produce 2 interviews back in January, February. I said exactly that. So it's there on the record. I think the confusion is, and you're seeing this at the FDA VRBPAC meeting and CDC, there's not agreement on what the goals are. There are some who say we should only recommend the 3rd immunization if you're seeing a lot of breakthrough hospitalizations and deaths. And I've said, no, I don't agree with that. I think, I don't want to get COVID. I don't want to get long COVID. It's not only because I want to I'm worried about going to the hospital. Sure, I want to be vaccinated so I don't go to the hospital, but I don't want to have gray matter brain degeneration. And so I think there were some differences of opinion in the scientific community who felt you should only recommend the 3rd dose for hospitalizations, which never made sense to me. So that's the reason for it. So there is declining protection against infection, possibly hospitalization, and that 3rd dose is going to really rev up your virus neutralizing antibodies 30 to 40 fold, and it's going to do 2 things for you. One, protect you, give you longer lasting protection, maybe for years. I don't necessarily think we're going to need a booster every year. There's not complete agreement on that, but I don't think so. And it really gives you by giving really high levels of virus neutralizing antibody, it gives you protection against the variants. So that's the Pfizer. The Moderna one's a little different. It seems to be holding up a little better, partly because there's much more mRNA in the Moderna vaccine than the Pfizer vaccine. And also they gave it an extra week apart. If you remember, for Moderna, you got a dose and you waited 28 days. So that extra week, maybe making it last longer. I think we're going to need a 3rd immunization for that as well. And the company's now working with the FDA on that. So don't be surprised if you hear about getting a booster for Moderna. And finally, for the J&J vaccine, I always thought that was a 2-dose vaccine to begin with, and that's basically what's going to happen eventually, but not yet.
Let me ask you a couple of questions, Dr. Hotez, that I know people are asking. How effective are the COVID-19 vaccines at helping protect against severe disease and death from the variants of the virus? I think a lot of people are confused. I've heard people saying, the vaccines are not real vaccines. They don't keep you from getting, they only keep you from getting severe symptoms and everything in between.
Yeah. What happened was the vaccines were released on the basis of showing it prevents symptomatic illness and severe disease. But then in Israel, they put out studies showing it's also stopping infection as well, stopping asymptomatic infection. And that meant the masks would come off if you were vaccinated, and that was really exciting. But now with this Delta variant, as I mentioned, there's like 1,000 times more virus there if you do get breakthrough infection. So there's transmission again. I think when we get the third immunization, it'll restore it back to where it was. So my hope is with the third immunization that we can go back to not having to wear masks anymore once we get that. I don't know that for certain yet, but then those studies will come out. But that's my hope.
If you are fully vaccinated, can you resume many activities that you were participating in before the pandemic?
Yes, but the answer is yes. I mean, and again, especially if you're eligible for that third immunization, I think that's going to help a lot as well in terms of resuming activities. I mean, I'm basically, I'm resuming my normal activities pretty much. The difference is when I go to work, when I go into the office or the lab, I have a mask on unless I'm by myself in the office. And that's the difference. If I go to, I don't go to a lot of stores, but if I go to HEB or whatever, I'll still have a mask on. And I'm not going to a lot of restaurants, but my youngest son and his girlfriend sometimes on a Sunday night like to go out to dinner. So with my wife, so sometimes we'll do that. And there, I'll try to eat outdoors if I can, especially now that the terrible weather is ending. It's getting a little nicer now.
Yeah. Should you wear a mask indoors in public if you are in an area of substantial or high transmission, even if you've been vaccinated?
The answer is yes, because the vaccines are not perfect. I think once, if you get your third immunization, we'll wait for the data. And I think there's a possibility you may not need to have a mask at all. But it depends on your level of comfort. I think the hard part, I think the qualifying statement you made is that high level of transmission in the community. So for instance, if I were going up to Massachusetts or Vermont right now, I may feel comfortable not wearing a mask, but we still have a pretty screaming high level of transmission here in Texas. If you were to look, if Texas were a country, and many people think it is, if Texas were a country, our COVID transmission rate would be right near the top globally. That's how bad things are right now in Texas. Wow. But I think it looks like it's slowly starting to come down so that possibly as we move into October, November, if it stays down, then we might feel more comfortable doing that.
One of the major issues that people talk about are the side effects, and many people have a fear that the vaccine will actually give them COVID-19. And I know some of that is based on information from years ago when, for example, people got the TB, vaccine and they ended up contracting TB, or, they got the flu shot, 20 years ago and they got the flu really bad. Can you speak to that and some of the expected side effects, the normal side effects that you can expect from getting the vaccination, especially if you have a weakened immune system?
Well, remember, the three vaccines that we use in the U.S., the Pfizer-BioNTech, Moderna vaccine, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine are not live viruses. So you cannot get COVID from those vaccines. And you cannot get COVID from our vaccine. We're making a recombinant protein vaccine that's now being scaled up for production in India and Indonesia. So you will not get COVID from the vaccine. The vaccine will give you virus neutralizing antibodies to protect you from getting an infection. There are side effects. So let me tell you what happened with me. First dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, I felt fine. Second dose, I had some arm soreness, and that night, the following night, 24 hours later, I had some shaking chills for about 4 hours. And the next morning, I went to work, I didn't feel great. I took an Advil, I felt fine. And that's going to be your experience. So they do stimulate the inflammatory response. Some people have worse reactions, but most people handle it very well. And remember, it's a heck of a lot better than getting COVID-19.
What is your position on children being vaccinated? I know that several of the vaccines have been approved for children 12 and up, and now there's a move to vaccinate children 5 and up. We did a story a couple of weeks ago. Tragically, a little girl, 4 years old, contracted a fever, caught COVID from her mother, treated it like a regular, fever, flu situation, and the little girl died overnight. What is your position on vaccinating our children, and at what age?
So we are seeing now with this Delta wave in the summer and now into the fall, unprecedented numbers of kids getting hospitalized with COVID, and even pediatric intensive care units, which we hadn't seen before, are filling up. I don't think the virus is selectively targeting kids. I think it's just basically racing through unvaccinated populations, and everyone's getting swept up, including the kids. So I do think we should vaccinate younger kids. And my understanding is Pfizer BioNTech is now applying to the FDA for emergency use authorization in school-age kids, 5 to 11, so that all the kids K through 12 can get vaccinated. And then Moderna and J&J will follow on in that. So when that will happen, I'm hoping by Scott Gottlieb, who goes on TV a lot. He's former FDA commissioner. He's on the board of Pfizer now. Seems to think by Halloween, end of October, it might be available. So he probably has the inside baseball more than anybody on that. So I think that's probably the time frame. The problem is this, Dr. Cofield, which is that just like up in the Northeast, all of the parents are vaccinating all their adolescents. They're going to vaccinate all the younger kids as well, if they're eligible. But down here, where they're not parents aren't vaccinating adolescents, it's going to be the same problem.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're really serious about halting transmission in the schools, it means that pretty much anyone who walks into a public school has to have a mask on, maybe with the exception of some of the special needs kids. Everybody who walks into the school who's eligible has to be vaccinated, but we just can't get the leadership in the state to put in place mask and vaccine mandates. So what you've got are the county judges trying to work around it and do it and going rogue and doing it on their own, which is good, but it's too bad that we just can't do this on a statewide scale.
One of the anti-vax statements is around the COVID-19 vaccine changing your RNA or your DNA. Can you just speak to that? You've already addressed the issue of the fact that none of the vaccines have a live virus within them. But can you speak to this changing of your RNA or your DNA?
Yeah, they even say it causes genetically modified humans.
Yeah.
It's all nonsense, right? It's all meant to scare, and it works. It scares people. But it's absolutely not true. So first of all, RNA does not go into the nucleus of this. Remember, you had to take high school biology and you learned about the cell and the cytoplasm and the nucleus.
Right.
Well, there was a reason for that. Because the RNA doesn't go into the nucleus, so it can't modify your DNA. And it's not DNA, it's RNA. Also, RNA is a very unstable molecule, and it falls apart pretty quickly. And that's why you have to, in order to deliver it, you have to put it in this complicated lipid coat, which you have to keep frozen at minus 80 degrees. And as soon as you thaw it, you have to give it right away, and it goes in and gets taken up by your cell, and then gets made into protein. Then the RNA dissolves pretty much right away. It gets broken down by enzymes called ribonucleases. So there's no modification of any RNA or DNA.
So for those people,
and not even any plausibility for it either. That's the other big thing they say along the same lines. They say it causes infertility, right? And where did they get that from? They got that because they made up that fake claim for the HPV vaccine for cervical cancer and other cancers. And it worked for them. It scared off people getting HPV vaccine, even though it was absolutely not true. And they copy paste that onto COVID-19 vaccine. So you're seeing a lot of that happening also. And, fake assertions that worked for the anti-vaccine groups in the past, they'll just copy paste onto COVID-19 vaccines.
So for the people who are listening, I know some in particular who are saying, look, if I get the vaccine, you're saying it's going to save my life. It's going to keep me from suffering from the most serious symptoms of COVID-19. But I can still be asymptomatic and still spread the disease. If I get the vaccine, I can still be asymptomatic and spread the disease. I want you to speak just for a moment of the difference between the unvaccinated person who contracts the disease and can spread it, whether they're asymptomatic or not, and the vaccinated person.
That's right. So if you're not vaccinated, you get the virus and you'll either get sick and you'll be in bed or in the hospital, or you may be lucky and have asymptomatic illness, and it occurs in about a third of those individuals. Those people have the reason you're shedding virus, the reason you could still spread it is because you have lots of virus replicating in the mucous membranes of your nose and mouth, and you're shedding the virus as you're speaking. What happens if you're vaccinated, though, those virus neutralizing antibodies get into your mucous membranes of your nose and mouth and stop the virus shedding. So you might be shedding virus for a day or two after getting it. If you're vaccinated and you're exposed to the virus, you might be shedding for a day or two, but not for weeks or many days as you would if you're unvaccinated. And now at the third immunization, it may stop it altogether.
Let's talk about herd immunity. The immediately previous president, talked about herd immunity and we're just going to let it kind of run rampant. Everybody's going to get it and we'll be fine. There are some countries who use that strategy and seem to have used it successfully to make sure that they
they didn't really use it successfully. They lost a lot of lives. So a lot of people got hospitalized, and it's just a flawed strategy. It didn't work. And the idea was, well, we'll just sequester the old people away in some, I don't know where they were doing it, and then let the young people run around. And first of all, a lot of young people got sick. Second of all, nobody ever counted on young people visiting their parents or grandparents, and that was just a disaster. That's what happened in Sweden and elsewhere. And so it doesn't work. So this concept of herd immunity goes like this. So with measles, which is very highly transmissible, if you can vaccinate over 90% of the population, it seems to interrupt transmission of the virus. I don't even like using the term herd immunity anymore, because you had, people like Senator Rand Paul make up fake numbers on when herd immunity occurs. They're saying at 20% or 40% of the population. It was nonsense. So with measles, you need about 90% of the population immunized, and then transmission slows or halts. And that's probably true of COVID as well. So if we get up 90% of the population, I think we could vaccinate our way out of it. But I specifically avoid the term herd immunity because it's been so misused by people on the far right for their own political agendas.
So we talked earlier, and I referenced President Biden's commitment to help fight COVID around the world. And I'd like to know, one, is America, is this a fight that we should get involved in? One, because you often hear people say, well, charity begins at home and we should combat it at home. Not that he hasn't been trying to do that. And then secondly, are we doing enough to help the world fight COVID-19? So one, should we be in the fight? And then secondly, are we doing enough?
Well, we have to be in the fight, both because it's the humanitarian thing to do, and second, it's in our own enlightened self-interest, because all of the most troublesome variants have arose out of unvaccinated populations. And until we vaccinate the African continent and Latin America and Southeast Asia, we'll continue to have these variants. And right now, the whole African continent is pretty much unvaccinated. The problem has been that how we do this needs to be reframed a bit. And the president made an attempt at it at the UN General Assembly last week but I don't think he was very successful. Here's why. We have 1.1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa, 650 million people in Latin America. We have another 500 million to 1 billion people in the smaller, low-income Asian countries. We need to vaccinate 3 billion people with 6 to 9 billion doses of vaccines. And where's that going to come from? So the president talked about donating 100 million to 500 million doses of Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Well, you do the math. That's a very tiny proportion. And that's the problem. I mean, people are so focused on mRNA vaccines that, as any engineer will tell you, when you have a brand new technology, there's a learning curve before you know how to scale it up and make billions. I don't care what it is, widgets or anything else. Can take years to learn how to make billions of something for the first time. And that's the problem with the mRNA vaccines. We're not going to vaccinate the world with mRNA vaccines. And that's why we developed a low-cost recombinant protein vaccine that uses an old-school technology, the same technology used to make the recombinant hepatitis B vaccine, which people here in Houston are giving to their kids and grandkids for decades. It uses yeast fermentation technology and great safety profile, and there's no limit to the amount you can make. And that's what we're doing. And now our colleagues in India at one of the big vaccine producers, Biological Lear, is making 100 million doses a month. The Indian government has done an advanced purchase of 300 million. Working with Indonesia now, we're doing that. This is our Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development at Baylor, co-headed by myself and my science partner for the last 20 years, Dr. Mary Elena Patazzi. So we're now making the vaccine for the world. And every week we're getting Zoom calls from ministers of health, ministers of science, from you name it, Vietnam, Bangladesh, South Africa, Uganda, to Tanzania, to help them do the technology transfer of our vaccine. And that's the one I'm hoping will fill the gap. The frustration I'm having is we're not getting much help from the U.S. government in this, and not much help from the United Nations either. So we're doing this on our own and raising money privately through Texas philanthropy. So the Clayburgh Foundation has come through in a big way for us, and the Dunn Foundation, the MD Anderson Foundation, a couple of foundations in New York, like the JPB Foundation, J. Newman, and of all things, Tito's Vodka. So, Dr. Cofield, I know as a pastor, you're not supposed to encourage your members, the members of your church to drink, but if they happen to drink anyway, and if they happen to like vodka in their cocktails, Tito's is the one for them.
Well,
so they've come through in a big way. They provided $1 million for us to help.
Wow. Well, Dr. Hotez, what you all missed, it was bad timing, because if you had tweeted this last year to the president, you probably would have gotten all the funding you needed. Just tweet it to him. That's it. That's all you needed to do. Let me ask one other question as we get ready to close. Do you think vaccines, I know we're in this era of, civil and individual rights and liberty and the like, but do you think vaccines should be mandated like wearing seatbelts?
It depends where. I think for schools, we do this all the time, right? If you want to send your kid to school, you have to show that your kids were vaccinated against diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, measles, mumps, rubella, polio, Haemophilus influenza type B. And that's what we should do for COVID-19. So in the schools, yes, I think so, especially when the younger kids are eligible. But they're going to fight us tooth and nail on that because of this phony health freedom, medical freedom concept, which is just so self-defeating. I was hoping we wouldn't have to go to mandates. I was hoping that people would just see. It was so obvious to everyone that you don't want to get COVID and go into the ICU, but we're going to have to, we're going to have to do some federal mandates. The problem is the way our founding fathers did this, the way Jefferson and Madison did this, they gave limits to the power of the federal government. And I don't see that even with all the federal laws put in place, that'll only get us a small part of the way there. We're going to have buy-in from the state legislators and and the governors, and I don't see that happening, in many states in this part of the country.
Yeah, I think it's going to be virtually impossible, to your point, especially as we have free movement between states, and we go from one state where there are no guidelines and no mandates to a state that has, a monicum of guidelines, to a state that has very harsh guidelines. It's just, to me, it's just going to become cyclical, that we're just going to keep on infecting each other as we're just traveling and moving.
Well, here's what's going to happen. By the end of this year, pretty much every American, likely, well, I should say, but a high percentage of Americans will be either vaccinated, or they'll be infected, survived, and then get vaccinated, or they'll be infected and have lost their lives, or they'll be infected and have some partial immunity, and that will slowly interrupt transmission of the virus. The problem with the individuals who are infected and recovered, if they get vaccinated on top of that, they're good. They do really well, really high levels of virus neutralizing antibody. If they're infected and recovered, some people will be resistant to reinfection, others aren't, and you don't know who you are. And that's the problem. So starting next year, all of those individuals who are infected, recovered, but didn't get vaccinated, large numbers of them are going to get reinfected and possibly also get very sick and die. Yeah. That's going to be the message, trying to get everyone we can, either to prevent them from getting infected in the first place, or if they're infected and recovered, get them vaccinated on top of that.
Dr. Hotez, thank you for sharing with us today and taking time out of your Sunday. Man, I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening with your family. And, my hope and prayer is that people have been listening and people will spread this news regarding the efficacy of the vaccines, knowing that it's better to get vaccinated than to not get vaccinated, and that people will try to debunk and demyth whatever those things are that are out there that people are holding on to, those falsities that people are holding on to in order to not get vaccinated. But thank you so much. And thank you for what you do, man. I can just imagine, you're on with us, but it seems like every time I turn on the television, you're on, and I'm like, man, I don't know how he gets any work done.
Yeah, the problem is they still have a day job, right? So, or a couple of day jobs, and
right.
And we're trying to make a vaccine for the world. So it's I haven't slept much in 2 years, but I asked God for a big, interesting, complicated life, and she delivered. So
yeah, well, you got it
in a big way.
Yeah, you got it.
Why did I get my MD and PhD? For this moment, and so in some ways I feel blessed.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate it. Thank you so much, Dr. Hotez.
Thank you, Dr.
The late Vernon John said, if you see a good fight, get in it. And I always add, if you don't see a good fight, start one. And without question, the fight against COVID-19 and the variants is a fight that you want to get into. Please, ma'am, please, sir, get the vaccine. Whatever side effects you think will result from getting the vaccine, it is worse if you contract this variant. You heard Dr. Hotez say, this variant is man, 10, 20, 100 times stronger. It's coming with a vengeance. And so you see some people who, contracted COVID early on, who survived, who didn't survive this variant. But the vaccines are there to help you. So make sure you do your part to not just save yourself, but save somebody else as well. You've been listening to Real World, Real Talk on your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for jazz and more, KTSU. Stay tuned for truth coming up on this station. Till next time, bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Real World, Real Talk. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified of new episodes every week. Follow us via social media using the @RWRTDZ username on all platforms: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To submit any comments, questions, sponsor opportunities, or future show suggestions, visit us online at rwrtdz.com or via email at info at rwrtdz.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you've been inspired to be the change you want to see in the world today. Until next time, be real, keep it real, and stay real.